Okay, listen, there's less of an agenda for this particular session. I'm really happy to cover some of the things we talked about just now in the roadmap, things that came up earlier in the sessions. If you've got other stuff you want to talk about, put on our radar, Carly and I. We're also joined by Lauren, product marketing. I see Jason, Sean from the Fishtown team, some others. So we're here. What's on your minds?
What's new to Cloud Enterprise?
What's new to Cloud Enterprise? Yeah, so we've had a lot of more beta functionality that we're working to get into sort of general availability. So the first one is, it's not as exciting as exposures, but it's things like these kind of more rock solid single sign-on integrations. There's a user interface for managing role-based access control, which you used to have to do through the back end. That's going to be available to everyone by default, hopefully in the next week or so. Some things we're thinking about. I guess I'm going to be careful not to make concrete time commitments, but I can just give you like the soon. One of the things we really want to do is update how user licenses are assigned from identity providers. So if you have a user join from like just say Okta or G Suite or Azure Active Directory, they automatically get a developer license. But it'd be much better if we check their groups. And if they run a group called DBT Cloud Developers, they got a developer license, otherwise read only. Just to help with administration, things like that. That's coming up. For the most part, though, it really comes down to a question of like what's enterprise versus what's team or the developer tier. And a lot of the stuff we're cooking up is going to be broadly available to all DBT Cloud users. A lot of the stuff we talked about today, like better exposures integrations and like deferred execution, Slim CI, all that's going out to everyone.
Cool. And just to follow up on that, one of the things that I sort of hinted at a little bit earlier, but I've been looking at my Snowflake bill and trying to get a sense of like what % of that bill is DBT inflicted. Mm-hmm. And are there like decisions that we can be making about like how frequently to run these models, which models clearly have poorly written SQL that's taking forever to run. And I understand that some of that, that we can get some of that metadata out of the artifacts, but I'm sort of curious. It seems to me like there could be an opportunity. Like I don't know for sure what this number is, but it's definitely more than 25%, probably closer to 50% of my bill is literally DBT runs, which for a large enterprise is like a lot of money. So I don't know. Part of me was like thinking, is there ways that like DBT, like cloud for the enterprise could sort of better help expose some of that stuff? Because I think that I'm now spending a little bit more time and people's time on my team, having them think about like performance and cost in a way that I wasn't thinking about that as much before.
Yeah, it's funny, these second order problems, like I'm sure a lot of us would pay money to not have to deal with a lot of the chaos that comes with not having, core modeling. But then once you have the core modeling, it's like, okay, we have to manage our costs. I think you were so spot on to point to metadata as being part of the solution. We've stood up this metadata API, and one of the things we're really excited to do is push that information back into the warehouse and maybe even provide DBT models on top of the raw data so that you can analyze, like a lot of different things. We can talk about that, but from a cost perspective, like which models are taking the most time? Are the models taking more time to build over time? Like, are they getting slower? What are the opportunities for improvement? Where are the bottlenecks? That's one that I'm so fascinated in. Like on Snowflake, compute time is directly translated into dollars. And so if something is slow, it's not fun because it means your data is going to be less fresh, or take longer to run. It's also expensive. And so understanding where the bottlenecks are in a run, is it like every model is slow and we should make them all faster? Or is it like this one model that becomes a bottleneck for everything else downstream in the DAG, and you need to refactor that, break it up into smaller pieces so that it runs faster and can be more parallelized? These are really interesting analyses we can do on top of the metadata that DBT collects.
Yeah, and I even want to like take it one step further, which is like look at my Snowflake query history and say, why am I building this model every day or on weekends when nobody's using it on the weekend? And it just seems like there's a way to have like the Snowflake metadata or your data warehouse metadata about usage, like better inform the runs and which models you're choosing to run, as opposed to like either just doing a DBT run every single day or which ones we're running. We've got lot of different kinds of runs, but they're really informed just by like what we think the business needs are and not by how frequently they're actually using this.
Yeah, it's a great point. I just spoke a tiny bit in the roadmap session about things like run on merge, but for basically every view in the database, you can imagine that you don't need to run that, at least on Snowflake, unless the code has changed. So that feels really powerful. Like, imagine only refreshing the tables and incremental models on some schedule, and the views only get updated on merge.
Yeah, true. That brings something up that I just was testing this morning. Great conversation, by the way, because we're actively thinking. Oh, I was talking about this stuff this morning. So I was playing with using in DBT Cloud using a deferred run from prod with modified state selectors, and it seemed to work wonderfully. Is there something about that I'm missing that would not be a best practice on merges? So when we want to release to prod, I was considering, just doing state modified plus with full refreshes and defer from the last successful prod build. Why not?
Yeah, let's do it. I think the thing I'd point to is that DBT Cloud doesn't presently have the ability to execute a run on merge. You'd have to orchestrate that.
Yeah, sorry, yeah. And I do. Yeah, I've got a GitHub action for that. So I've got a GitHub action that fires off the build. So yeah, but we've got that problem solved. But we hadn't thought of doing it. That we were segregating builds, sort of like Ben was talking about, like based on when we think they need to run and things like that. And then we had a prod build that just ran. And I built one just to see what would happen if I did the state selectors, and it just worked wonderfully. And I'm like, that seems like best practice to me for merges.
Yeah. Oh yeah. We always want to be in the position of providing tools in DBT. So like, this is something Jeremy talked about a little bit earlier. State selectors, deferral, artifact management, state, things like that. Like, these are kind of raw tools that you can build on top of rather than point solutions. So it's totally the intended consequence that you can cobble these things together in a way that makes sense for your environment. That sounds awesome.
Thanks.
Yeah, and you know what? I think we'd love to, if there's any way we can help out with that, we'd love to talk about it. I think it sounds like a great use case.
No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool.
I'm curious, back on Ben's question, and maybe, or Drew or Ben, if you've already kind of oriented towards using warehouses that are pre-sized for different workloads and you're kind of doing it at the model or the folder layer. Because what we're dealing with is some merges need an Excel warehouse because it's a big fact table, but we have tons of smaller tables that need extra small maybe. So separate from the concurrency, like it almost seems like we're starting to think, trying to identify the right warehouse, but then you'd also actually like to be able to catch, spilling to disk automatically out of the Snowflake logs, say, that thing has started to run slow, and it's because I'm spilling to disk. Let me bump up the size. That's like phase 2. But curious, with your spend that you said is kind of noticeable, are you already kind of segmenting workloads based on what you can guess is the right warehouse size?
We are, but we're doing it, setting up like different environments inside of DBT Cloud. So we have like our production deployment environment, and that typically runs on a triple XL warehouse. And then we've got like our hourly running jobs that may run on like a medium or a large. And I don't know, Drew, I remember seeing there was a package we were using at some point that was like, on a full refresh, use this warehouse, whereas on a regular like incremental run, use a different warehouse size. I know that's like somewhat Snowflake specific and maybe this doesn't apply well across other data warehouses, but is that like functionality that exists, this like depending on full refresh or not, what approach you might take?
Yeah, so absolutely. I just dropped a link into the staging Breakout 3 channel. This is sort of model level configuration you can apply in DBT. And again, it's sort of like a tool that maybe you have to build some use case specific logic on top of, but you can imagine checking the like full refresh flag, and if it's provided, then dynamically configure the virtual warehouse that's employed. I think it'd be a lot better if we had information in DBT about, like, just say this is probably not, well, we can talk about it, but there's nothing immediately on the roadmap that will assist with this, but just say if this model tends to take more than I don't know, maybe it tends to process more than X number of bytes, then you should use this warehouse, versus if it's very small, like use the extra small. You can, of course, oh, go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, please.
Sounds like you can configure at the model level, or kind of at that level, maybe not. I could imagine using tags too. And then long term, yeah, it'd be great if it could be almost self-discovering and self-monitoring, but even just starting at that model level, or if there's a jump to then maybe use tags or something, or maybe you reorganize your models into subfolders that you can just say this whole folder is small tables. That makes sense as a starting point.
Yeah, the subfolder thing should work out of the box, where you can configure it right in your DBT project.yaml file and say, like, these are your, you know, raw event data staging models, and they're really slow. Throw the Excel at them.
Awesome, thanks.
The one other thing to say is, like, you can also make it environment specific. So maybe a development, I guess it depends on your cost and speed trade-offs, but maybe you say, use this in development, use that in prod. It's a good approach too. Great question. Thanks, Joel. I'm curious, there's a lot of folks on here too. Good to be here with all of you. Thanks for taking the time. Curious if anything's on your minds about enterprise, current, future, maybe past. If you want to.
What's on my mind right now is it's really cold in Texas. That's what's on my mind.
I heard that. Surprising. I heard about
my kid from school because the roads, they're shutting them down.
Yeah, icy roads, right? Bad.
If I could ask another one,
sure.
What do you see as the future of the IDE in DBT Cloud? You know, initially I was excited about it, but then I sort of found that, like, at least most of the engineers preferred to work in IDEs that they were comfortable with, that they, there's obviously a good case to be made for using, VS Code and other platforms that people have, large companies have spent years and years building. Like, what do you see as sort of like the value proposition for the IDE? And is your perspective at this point, which is sort of like, it's lightweight enough, if it can sort of do enough for like a basic use case, but we're limiting it to that? Or do you think, like, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, as I try to roll out DBT to a more decentralized model where I have like senior analyst like folks in business units contributing to our core project, should I really be driving them to use the IDE, or should we be pushing more of the, VS Code and that whole approach?
Yeah. Amy Chen, I'm going to let you answer this one. I'm just kidding. Unless you want to. Like, I would love to hear your feedback too, your input.
I don't think you want me to say.
No, come on, I'm just kidding.
Given what's recorded, though I have ideas.
Yeah, we got a lot of good ideas, and we got a growing team, and we're going to put them into action. Let me say this. We are acutely aware of the fact that there are hundreds of engineers working on editors like VS Code or Atom, and that's not where we can create the most value for DBT users. It's not by replicating VS Code. And like, I will tell you, I have background in computer science. My editor of choice is Vim. I feel at home on the command line in a way that I typically don't in web editors. And so I can give you my take on this. Is I want the IDE to be a differentiated experience where it is like the best possible place to write DBT code. I don't want to frame this as a sort of commitment to anything that, we're still sorting out exactly how to do, but I'll just give you in the broadest of strokes. This is things like understanding the shape of your DAG, or documentation about your project in line, like making it easier to edit these files that are kind of disparate, but giving you a UI where you can do it all in one place. And really just making it tailored to like the DBT development experience first and foremost, accepting the fact that some of the editor niceties you would get in VS Code might need to come later for us. The other thing I would say is I talked about client server and just barely touched on it. I can dig up that blog post I was talking about and drop it in the chat too. We want to bridge this gap where it's not a question of, if you enjoy the local development workflow and you're comfortable with Git on the command line, then there's no opportunity for cloud to play a role in that. Like, the reason we built the IDE in the first place is because it's very challenging to get DBT installed onto many different workstations in a way that has consistent DBT versions and Python environments, things like that, and also a secure approach to managing credentials. And so one of the things we really want to do is unlock the local development use case that's powered by DBT Cloud, such that you don't have to choose like, do I put my credentials in a profiles.yaml file or do I use single sign-on behind role-based access control? Like you could have both of them and get the best of both worlds. I'm really excited about that feature.
I had considered using it's sort of in line using some of the, the RPC stuff, like, right. Like we have a lot of make targets in our repo to do various different things. And that's one thing I had considered, like standing up an RPC server to like run just one model or even just see the output or something. Cause it's tedious to go navigate to your targets and find a model. So, and I always envision in my head what your IDE is basically the RPC running, and accepting requests. So I was wondering if there's a way, like, IDE plugins that use that, like against the DBT Cloud account or something, seemed like would be super, super valuable to me.
So we're going to do another one of these events next quarter, and I would love for you to come up and talk to the community about more of these ideas. It's exactly how we're thinking about it. It's why we're thinking about the foundations and AIs and creating value outside of the Chrome of DBT Cloud. Like there's a lot of opportunity to integrate with other tooling, whether it's tools in the data stack or local development workflow tools, things like that.
Great, thanks.
Love that.
I'll be there.
Yeah.
Hey, Drew, there's a couple questions in the chat. I'm not sure if you saw them yet.
No, I totally missed them. Do you want to actually like maybe call them out to me? It'll be like,
yeah, I will. So question from Philip, is there anything in DBT like Dataform's run caching feature where we'd check the source table's metadata without the query costs and then only run the model if that source has changed since the last run? I think you're kind of touching on that earlier.
Yeah, I really like the way Simon talks about this, like the metadata creates value in the entire system. DBT's got a notion of data sources. There's a notion of source data freshness. And I feel like one of the future states for deferred execution or Slim CI is rerunning only pieces of the DAG that select from updated source tables. So if we know your source table hasn't changed since the last time you ran DBT, don't run anything built on top of it, unless the logic has changed. Cool. I'd love to do that, yeah.
And then the other question from Mike is the roadmap for Databricks integration. What does that look like?
Yeah, so this is also, it kind of comes to the core cloud breakdown. The entirety of the SQL compilation, DDL, DML writing, things like that, and database execution for both Vanilla Spark and Databricks, all that's open source. So if you actually want to see the roadmap, it takes the shape of like GitHub issues, and I can drop a link to the repo in case anyone hasn't seen it. All of that's going to happen. Funny, just replying with the link, but hopefully, Mike, are you actually in here? Okay, Mike, I see Mike. So we'll talk about it and I'll follow up with more information later. Yeah, the thing that's happening inside a cloud has a lot more to do with the creation and management of connections, environments, things like that. It has to do more with how we get DBT plugins, like the ones we have for Spark or Presto or et cetera, how we get those live inside of DBT Cloud and how you can administrate them without us needing to build kind of specific integrations for every single plugin that folks want to use. There are integrations for, I saw like Oracle, and I know one's coming from Materialize, and I actually saw a Dremio one, which is very cool. We want to make it so that if you build one of those plugins and you want to run it inside of DBT Cloud, you can do that. So it kind of speaks to like a common interface for all these plugins. So as far as what's the roadmap for things like sourcing or writing to Parquet files, the place to check that out is going to be the DBT Spark repo. For things like administration of a Spark connection inside of DBT Cloud, we're just going to smooth out some of the inconsistencies that exist and sort of the UX of doing that today. Great question. Thanks, Mike. Anyone here use Spark as a part of your production workloads? Right.
Hey, Drew, is there any, this has been brought up like before, but I might just be a bit out of the loop, but like a configuration file to define all of your environments and runs inside of DBT Cloud, either does that exist or is something like that on the roadmap? Only because it would almost be nice if I didn't have to use the UI so much to make those changes. And that way, like if someone on the team wants to change the deployment to use a quadruple Excel warehouse in Snowflake, I have a little bit of greater awareness and approval on that process.
Yeah, I'm gonna keep applying all the caveats of like none of this is prioritized in the near term, but we've talked about internally the idea of something like a terraform provider for dbt cloud so that you can manage an account or an instance. Yeah, okay, seeing some praise. We'd like that. The prerequisite is the kind of stable and well-documented API that we feel really comfortable delivering like things on top of it too. So there's sort of an order of operations there. But yeah, we think that'd be great too. The thing I'd point to in the near term is like what should live inside of cloud and what should be version controlled within your DBT project. So one of the things we're really excited to do, I think this is going to come up as a part of maybe the 1.0 for DBT conversation, is like a version controlled file for jobs. So instead of creating a job in the user interface and saying these are the steps and here's the runtime out and notifications, et cetera, being able to version control that, even like potentially setting a schedule. And then if you commit a change, it'll update that job inside of the DBT Cloud Chrome. And actually, though, will pull from your DBT project code. That'll help because I can imagine things like you overriding connection or environment details in this file for the non-sensitive, bits like the warehouse to use or the schema to connect to or whatever. So I think that could be kind of a nearer term approach, or at least maybe a more foundational approach where you can update a job schedule by merging a pull request instead of going into the UI.
Yeah, and what you were just saying there, as much as I'm a Terraform junkie from way back, if there's such a thing, but having something like Ben's talking about tends to make more sense because we use DBT Cloud for our CI/CD anyways, right? And if you're using Terraform, that implies that you have some other step,
right?
Sort of, that's what DBT Cloud is saving me. So,
yeah. Let me pull up the issue here. It's going to be, I think we're calling these things workflows. There's going to be a bunch of kind of different issues that I'll point in the same direction, but let me see if I can find it. Give DBT basic workflow capabilities. I'll give you just one starting point in the channel, and certainly we'll thread it up if there's anything that jumps out at you as being a good idea or a bad idea in there. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, because it seems like that's also part of the metadata, right? Like, and a model should be self-aware of how frequently the job is running to create it, right? We sort of use like freshness tests and stuff like that are more like precise, but I also want like somebody also ought to be able to look at our docs and be like, oh, this runs Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9 a.m. And doesn't run on weekends. Like, it almost seems like if they don't know when the jobs are running, like they don't have a complete picture of how your data warehouse kind of works. I know they can say like, oh, it's up to date, all is good, but like, I want more,
It's funny. It's like, do you want to look backwards or forwards, right? So one of the things we can do with the metadata is this model did run Monday, Wednesday, Friday at noon, and it took 10 minutes or whatever. The other thing we can do is look at the schedule and say like, when will this run next? I imagine that gets hard with like model selection and trying to intersect like a cron schedule with the specific steps, whether or not that thing is selected. Maybe you're saying run all of my views and we got to figure out if it's a view or not. So I think looking backwards might be a more tractable approach in the near term, but I agree with you looking forwards, like when will this run next at a model level feels pretty powerful. Or we could apply ML and just predict the future from historical runs. Just kidding.
Hey everybody, I'm not on the product team. So if you start asking me about what's coming up on the product roadmap, I'll just make a lot of promises and then Drew will get back and I'll tell him what I promised. But what I do is I lead our solutions architect group here at Fishtown. And what that means is when we go into the sales cycle, we typically have a sales director paired with a solutions architect on every call. So we're kind of that bridge between sales and product and engineering. And we love to be all things technical. So if you have any questions about what we do or just about what we're seeing on calls, I'd be happy to try to answer those for you. Or if you want a few minutes break, you can take that too.
I'm sorry, I'm asking so many questions. If anybody else, please, by all means, weigh in. I'm curious to know from a solution, solution point of view, what like the DR strategy is for like DBT Cloud. You know, there haven't been many outages with DBT Cloud, but I'm just kind of curious, you know, if it were Monday at 6 a.m. when sort of a lot of our core large jobs are running DBT Cloud were down, that would obviously impact a lot of our like executive level reporting. So I'm just kind of curious, like internally, how does DBT Cloud think about DR?
It is a great question. I don't fully feel equipped to answer that exactly. Probably Drew might be able to help with that. Connor would probably be the best person to answer that question. He's not on the call. I don't know if Amy, if you've seen anything documented on that.
Given that Drew's back, I'm just gonna punt it to Drew.
Right.
Yeah, I missed the first half. Could you
Asking about disaster recovery. So like, how do we think about disaster recovery? It's Monday morning, everybody's jobs or important jobs are supposed to run and every DBT Club goes down.
I hope not. Yeah, Carly, I'm not sure if we're talking about this one thing publicly yet. So let me DM you just to ask and I'll drop in the chat. Anyway, we go through DR, IR scenarios. We're talking about SOC 2, right? That's public. Yeah, okay. Recently SOC 2 type 2 certified, if I'm not mistaken. And yeah, as part of that, we went through DR, IR exercises. We've got a team of site reliability engineers hooked up to all sorts of PagerDuty alerts such that we know what's going wrong, both in the multi-tenant DBT Cloud environment and also in single-tenant environments. If they're out there, we get notified about anything that might be amiss. Ideally, before it turns into any sort of an outage. So yeah, we really want DBT Cloud to be like the most reliable possible place to run these jobs. And so we're going to put we have been and we will continue to put a lot of effort into making sure that's the case. And like there's downtime, it happens, but we want to make sure that we know about it as soon as possible and it's mitigated immediately. Yeah.
That's a huge argument for what Ben was saying earlier about some sort of, file-based for what the jobs are. So, I mean, as a consumer of DBT Cloud, having that would make me feel much more comfortable because even if DBT Cloud went down, I know what all the jobs are and I'll spin up I'll spin up a console and run them myself.
Yeah.
That would be great.
Okay, this is an awesome thread. I would love to pick it up with you in the chat.